Welcome to the second of these presentations from the disciples of Christ on the readings from the fifth Sunday of Lent. This time a few thoughts on John's Gospel, the narrative of Lazarus. I say narrative of Lazarus, but Lazarus is not really the central part of the story. What Lazarus provides is a kind of a platform for a significant teaching of John about the death of Jesus, and it's from the cross we need to understand what's being said here about Lazarus. As we know, this part of the gospel shows us Jesus on the way to Jerusalem, and he knows, and the disciples know, the crowds know, the Jews know, and the leaders of the Jews know that this journey to Jerusalem will end up with Jesus being arrested, tried, tortured, crucified, and buried. Therefore, in the light of that, John understands well that his disciples are going to struggle. What happens when Jesus is gone? He knows that their faith is not all that strong at the moment, that they struggle to move beyond an earthly appreciation of Jesus and the identity of Jesus and the mission of Jesus to a more heavenly way of understanding what's going on in this man of Nazareth. He knows too that when Jesus is crucified and dies, then their faith is going to be sorely tempted. All the great things that they've discovered and experienced and shared risk being lost with the death of their master. So it's as if John pauses for a moment. While this first major journey is continuing, the journey of obedience to his Father, Jesus is shown to take a little side journey, another trip away from Jerusalem, this time down to Bethany. We're told Bethany is the home of Martha and Mary and the good friend of Jesus, Lazarus. Lazarus, we're told, has been sick, very sick, and finally he succumbs to the illness and he dies and is buried. So that's the situation, and the reality of the situation is brought home by the other characters in this particular part of the story. The crowd are mourning. They have their singing and their dancing and their feasting and all the things that are associated with death. For them, Lazarus is dead and buried and gone. Martha and Mary, they both understand that Lazarus is dead. While they believe that Jesus could have done something had he been there earlier, he was too late. Lazarus is dead. It's finished. Now for them, they have to deal with the consequences of that, their sorrow, their grief, their pain, their agony, their anger over the death of their brother. And then you have the disciples. The disciples too join with the crowd and Mary and Martha and trying to say to Jesus, well, look, he's dead. We're just too late. You could have come earlier. Why didn't you come earlier? And the way Jesus responds to all of that is to say that Lazarus isn't dead, he's sleeping. That you look at this thing from the wrong perspective. If you look at it from your experience and your limited human knowledge, yes, it's all over. He's finished. But if you understand that the Lord of life is in your midst and you look at this situation through the eyes of the Lord of life, then you see endless possibilities and potentials. That the reality from the human limited mind is not the same as the reality from the mind of God. And so they're the key ideas that John is trying to mix together. And this is all about preparing the disciples for the reality of the cross. How are they going to survive? So the hope of Jesus would be that when they're there mourning at Golgotha, they will look back to this moment with Lazarus and find some reassurance If Jesus was Lord of the dead in the case of Lazarus, then maybe there's hope when he himself is buried in the grave. Maybe in their experience of this incident in Bethany, they can find some hope when the whole world for them goes dark. And you have that great moment at the tomb when Jesus, the Lord of life, is surrounded by all these people who are stuck in their earthly perspective. They're all telling him, don't open the grave, Lazarus will stink. They laugh at him when he says Lazarus is but sleeping. And they just feel lost and powerlessness through the inevitability of opening the grave and finding a dead person. Then in the face of all of that, Jesus stands up and he says, Lazarus, come on out. Lazarus, still covered in shrouds, walks out. Now, the great moment there is the command of Jesus. And for the Jewish mind, it would take them back to that creation, those opening moments of creation, when by power of command, all things were created. God said, and so it was. God said, and so it was. Here we have Jesus doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same power of life over chaos and darkness and the swirling waters of the deep. Lazarus, break free of the bonds of death. Come out of the darkness of the tomb into the light of the world. And so it was. Lazarus came forth from the grave. It's a great moment. And Jesus is then able to return back to his journey, having planted in the minds of his disciples the one reality they need to deal with every calamity they face, every dark moment, every moment of uncertainty, every fear and anxiety. They can go into those moments confident that they go in there with the Lord of life, the master of chaos, the victor over darkness alongside them. If God can raise Lazarus from the tomb through the power of his Son, then all things are possible for those who follow the Son. That's his message. And so disciples are able now to go to Jerusalem, and they have something to use in dealing with the dark moments there. And just as importantly for John is saying to his church, being a follower of Christ does not mean life is a rose garden. Does not mean that people won't suffer darkness. What it does is offer to the believer a light in the middle of that darkness. That even the grave is not the end for those who believe. For those who live in God through living in Christ, the grave is never the end. The darkness of death is not the final step in life. There is far more beyond the grave in Jesus. It's a great hope for the church today. There are many times when the church and disciples in general feel very much like struggling in darkness, facing overwhelming opposition, tempted to think that it's just a matter of hanging on till the end. As we saw with Ezekiel and the dry bones, and as we see with Lazarus coming out of the tomb, the message for Lent is it's an invitation to live again. It's an invitation to be transformed, to be lifted out of the darkness that we find, to have life begin again, to have a new opportunity of starting all over. But the key to it is living in Christ, living as Christ, following the Father's will, even if it means finding ourselves at the cross on Golgotha. let our prayer be that as we go into these final weeks of Lent, we can put our full energy into allowing ourselves to be opened up, emptied out, transformed, and rebuilt in the image of Christ. Amen.